We found out this week that the federal deficit, after a year in which it shrunk dramatically, is set to increase by $2 trillion next year. Joining me to talk about why this is happening and what could potentially be done to mitigate it is Marc Goldwein. He's the Senior Vice President and Senior Policy Director for the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Marc, thank you for coming on the DC Debrief. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing real good, thank you. And this caught a lot of people by surprise, it seems, because generally speaking, when you have an economy that's growing, you don't see the deficit expand the way that it looks like it's going to next year. So can you kind of break this down for us and give us some idea of why this is happening?
So prior to the pandemic, we were running $1 trillion a year deficits, and that was really high, frankly. But that was the normal. And then we had all the COVID relief, the unemployment, the checks, the PPP, remember it. And for a couple of years, we were running $3 trillion a year deficits. Last year, we came back down to $1 trillion. And what we thought was, well, this is back to normal. This is just back to our normal high deficits. But it turns out $2 trillion is the new normal. Last year's deficit of $1 trillion was kind of an aberration. We got it. It was only so low because we had very high capital gains realization, meaning people were selling a lot of stocks. We had big inflation, which actually boosts taxable income before the tax code catches up. And we had these other one-time factors. But this year, we're projecting deficits are about to be $2 trillion. And that's not mostly because of one-off things. That's mostly because $2 trillion, unfortunately, is the new normal.
And that's a lot. And I think most people recognize that that's a lot. And most people recognize that's unsustainable. So if you're looking at last year really just kind of being the aberration and not the norm, then the $2 trillion number for next year is, generally speaking, from what it sounds like you're saying, what we can expect moving forward even after next year, unless something radically changes.
That's right. So the $2 trillion is actually what it's going to be for this year, when this year is up. And then next year, maybe it'll be a little bit lower. Maybe it'll be 1.7 trillion or something like that. But I think we're going to be in roughly $2 trillion deficits for several years. And then if you look over the longer run, what we see is eventually deficits are going to start to really explode to 3 trillion, maybe even 4 trillion, particularly as Social Security and Medicare costs continue to rise. Our interest costs are growing. It's the fastest growing part of the budget. And tax revenue just isn't growing particularly quickly. It's falling way short of our spending.
So obviously, whenever you're budgeting, and as someone, I budget, and one of the things you look at offense and defense, right? Offense is how much money can you bring in, how much money can you earn, and then the other is how much money can you save by reducing your spending. And so there's two sides to this. So let's talk about revenue income first. What are some ways that the government could generate more revenue, generate more income? I mean, taxes is obviously going to be the first thing that pops to mind, but it's exceedingly unpopular in the electorate, in an electorate that's dealing with inflation and with a House of Representatives that's dominated by Republicans right now. So how do they go about generating more revenue?
So here's the reality. The United States is a relatively low tax country, and yet we keep passing more tax cuts. Now, this is especially one party, but honestly, it's really both parties, keeps passing more and more tax cuts. And so one thing I think we could do as a starting point is stop renewing those tax cuts. So a huge number of those tax cuts actually expire at the end of 2025, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017. In my opinion, some of those were really good policy that we should extend. Some of them were really bad policy that we should let expire. Some were okay policy that we could improve. But the first step would be don't extend that as is, because if we do, that's another $3.5 trillion added to the debt. Let's find a ways to do smart extensions that don't lose us any revenue. Number two, we should look at tax breaks. We call these tax expenditures because we really do a lot of spending in the tax code. We subsidize all sorts of activities, whether it's healthcare or mortgages or education or buying bonds, and we don't always subsidize them very efficiently. And so there's so much room to cut these tax breaks in ways that would actually improve the choices that people make, stop distorting business behavior, stop inflating healthcare and housing costs. And I think that's the best place to go. Beyond that, we may need to look to either raise rates or to look at some kind of new tax, like maybe a carbon tax or a value-added tax. I don't think those are in the political cards for now. But if the situation gets bad enough, they may have to be.
Right, and politically speaking, those are some of those. Even the ending of those tax cuts, there's going to be conservatives, Republicans fighting tooth and nail to stop that from happening. And of course, they'll argue that the problem is spending. We need to cut spending, and that there's no doubt that that has to be a part of any solution too. So from where you sit, what are some ways, some reasonable and ways that could actually happen in real life that we could actually cut some spending and in order to get the deficit under control?
So we actually took a good first step this year when on a bipartisan basis, we passed the Fiscal Responsibility Act, because that bill said that the appropriators can no longer spend whatever they want on the defense budget and on the core non-defense budget. They're capped, but those caps only last for 2 years. So we need to extend and build upon those caps to prevent the appropriator free-for-all. But the reality of the situation is what's driving our debt isn't defense spending. It's not government employees or welfare. It's health and retirement programs. And so what we really need to do is make Social Security solvent. Social Security is only 10 years from running out of money, from the trust fund running out of money. So we got to get those benefits and revenue in line. We can do that a little bit by people contributing more, but we should also look at adjusting the retirement age over time, slowing benefit growth for high earners, other things like that. And then we got to lower healthcare costs. And there are so many ideas that were in both the Obama budgets and the Trump budgets. There's such a wide recognition that we are spending too much on healthcare, and there's so much waste in the system that we ought to start with that before we, cut anyone's benefits on the healthcare side.
Well, do you have any examples of that? Like, what are some ways that we're wasting money on healthcare?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple. If you go to a doctor's office that is owned by a hospital, Medicare pays more than if you go to a private doctor's office giving you the exact same treatment. So we literally, for the exact same healthcare intervention, pay more if it just happens to be owned by a hospital. We got to cut that. That doesn't make any sense. Nobody thinks that makes any sense. We also have in Medicare these Medicare Advantage plans. It's a private alternative to Medicare. In many ways, they're more efficient than Medicare because they can manage care, and yet they cost the federal government about 10% more. That's because of the way that they're coding their patients to look less healthy, and it's because these quality bonuses that were meant to encourage good plans, but now everybody takes them. So we got to cut that excess, cut that fat, and then lastly, the incentives are totally backwards in Medicare. People buy these very expensive Medigap plans that are run by the AARP and the insurance companies that basically take all their skin out of the game. And so then they get a bunch of these extra procedures they don't need, paying way higher premiums for that. If we were just to restrict these Medigap plans and reform cost sharing in a way that makes sense, beneficiaries would have better involvement in their healthcare decision-making, and that could push down costs as well.
So outside of healthcare, are there any other areas of waste that you see that the government could maybe extract some savings from that as well?
Look, healthcare is by far the biggest pot. It's the biggest pot of overall spending and of waste. But there's no government program that should be exempt from scrutiny. We spent $5 trillion on COVID relief, and understandably, we wanted to get the money out in 2020 as fast as possible. And so we didn't worry about making sure it got to exactly the right person. But now in the year 2023, we ought to be figuring out who was defrauding the system and trying to get that money back. We ought to have coherent eligibility rules for unemployment and for food stamps and for Medicaid, where we're actually giving benefits to people that are supposed to get benefits. By the way, Medicaid also has another major problem, which is that states essentially cheat. The way that Medicaid works is it's jointly funded by the federal government and the states, but the states run it and they declare how much things cost. They have all sorts of tools they can use to basically inflate their cost to legally steal money from the federal government. We got to close those. We got to close those loopholes. The federal government should reimburse the states based on what they actually pay, not these make-believe numbers based on accounting tricks.
Interesting. So it sounds, there certainly are ways to kind of bring this down. I guess now that we're looking at a potential government shutdown here at the end of September, though, do you think that this number will impact negotiations? Should it impact negotiations? Should it impact what legislators are talking about in terms of spending for the next fiscal year?
So look, we got to keep the government lights on. right? It's the question of whether the government is running sustainably is a totally different one from whether we should shut it down, because a shutdown won't save any money. It's just going to create a lot of political hoopla. We're going to pay a bunch of federal workers to not work, right? And then we're going to reopen the government 3 weeks later. So it's actually going to cost us money because we're paying all these people not to work. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Now, on the flip side, politicians, since they don't follow the budget process, don't have many opportunities to really talk about debt issues. And so when there is one that comes up, like the need to fund the government, that's an opportunity to at least put this on the table. Maybe we could be talking about not holding the government hostage for deficit reduction, but coupling funding of the government with a commission to look at some of these bigger issues, right? Or a commitment to have some further conversation on how we're going to get healthcare costs down. We can't just keep letting years go by, ignoring this issue altogether.
Well, this is a problem that does not have an easy political solution, and certainly the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is keeping us all educated and informed on the state of the deficit and what can be done to help bring it down. Marc Goldwein, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.